Hi, this is Travis with another video for you guys. I'm here at Exercise Lab and I'm a doctor of physical therapy. And I realized I've uploaded quite a bit of rehab-related content, but I haven't yet talked about a pretty pesky problem called carpal tunnel syndrome. And that's essentially where you get compression through your carpal tunnel of this median nerve, which is one of your bigger nerves that runs through your arm and can give you pain anywhere in these, primarily these 3 digits in the palm. Sometimes it'll even catch your ring finger. And so sometimes it'll give you pain, it'll give you numbness, tingling. It can even give you weakness and atrophy or shrinking of the muscle size when it's more advanced. And so anybody who's been dealing with this problem knows it can be pretty pesky. It tends to be a more repetitive stress-related injury, although there can be genetic factors, obesity, pregnancy, there's other things that can play into it. And so I'm not going to be giving you kind of an exhaustive overview on carpal tunnel. In this video, I'm going to sort of assume you already know what you're up against. So you're not necessarily dealing with, a pinched nerve in your neck that's giving you hand pain. Hopefully you've already been diagnosed and so you sort of know what you're up against. But if you have carpal tunnel and you think you can exercise it out, or you've been told that you can, and you want to try and do some exercises for it, I'm going to show you pretty much the ones that I've found to be the most helpful today. I'm not necessarily reinventing the wheel, but I have put my own sauce on a few things. And so I want to show you some of the better ways to do these exercises and how I think you can kind of get the most bang for your buck. As always, that's kind of what we do here at Exercise Lab. So if you're interested in how to doing that stuff, go ahead and stay tuned and we'll get started. Okay, so I'm not going to necessarily exhaustively go through the anatomy of carpal tunnel today and how it starts, but I'm going to just kind of briefly touch on it. So we have these carpal tunnel bones here, or essentially carpal bones, and the tunnel is formed essentially with this roof, which is this sheet of connective tissue. We have a carpal ligament that runs here in this piece of connective tissue they call your flexor retinaculum, and basically that median nerve runs through here and it gets squished, it gets pinched on. And so you can get much higher levels of tension and essentially compression on that nerve than you would ordinarily have with somebody who had basically a normally functioning carpal tunnel. And so it's an entrapment syndrome. Essentially the nerve is entrapped, and nerves don't really like being stretched or compressed or pinched on, and they can start to degenerate. And so that initial pain you're feeling is kind of like, okay, let's do something about this. Over time, though, as you get increased buzzing, you start to get sensory loss. Things are starting to go numb. Then eventually you get motor loss. Things are starting to get weak. That nerve is basically degenerating, and once that nerve is gone, there isn't always a lot that can bring it back to life. So typically, anytime you're dealing with a nerve impingement or an entrapment issue, you want to try to intervene and catch it early. Again, once it's in its later stages, once you have that nerve damage where you got a lot of atrophy and weakness, you're not always going to bring that nerve back to life. So I'm going to assume in this video you're somebody hopefully in the earlier or maybe the mid stages of carpal tunnel, when conservative management kind of has a better chance of helping. So for somebody who has, again, significant nerve damage, you may need to do something more invasive like a carpal tunnel release. And even in that situation, that nerve might already be too degenerated. But again, I'll save that for, the discussion with the orthopedist. And hopefully in your case, it certainly isn't. But as always, I'm going to just say, when in doubt, get checked out. But again, I'm going to assume today you're going to be somebody who hopefully will respond well to this. And so let's go ahead and get started on exercise number 1. Okay, so this video today is pretty much going to have my least amount of equipment. I'm not going to show a lot of stuff to use. And so the most basic thing you can do in the early phases of carpal tunnel, if you're starting to get a little bit of maybe tingly, a little bit of pain, sometimes people can just kind of shake their wrists out. You can just kind of, almost like you're just making them floppy. And sometimes when people start to, they're at their keyboard and they're starting to get a little discomfort, maybe a little achy, you just kind of can move your arms down, just kind of flop them around, okay? So nothing fancy at all, and it's kind of looks silly. People are going to think you're like a big bird or something like that. Don't worry about what you look like. It's just a very simple way to kind of break it up. And really what it is, you're basically just freeing up that nerve a little bit. You're just kind of getting it gliding through that tunnel and hoping that, it's going to calm down. And so it essentially works a similar way that like nerve flossing would work, okay? And so again, you can shake that out, give it 20, 30 seconds if you want. You certainly can probably even do it for less. Sometimes 5, 10 seconds might be enough to kind of get it to go away. Ultimately, though, you probably want to take a little bit of a longer break if you can. So if you're, at the keyboard, you give it 5, 10 seconds, it goes away, and your keyboard right away again, you might be fanning the flames. So I would say maybe take a bathroom break. Try to just give that nerve a little bit longer break if you can, and then try to come back to it. Okay, so second exercise is going to be a wrist extension stretch, okay? And so essentially just going to peel those fingers back, try to extend your wrist. Now, depending on how symptomatic you are, sometimes that can actually be a little bit aggravating. So, they always show people kind of going really far into extension. You can even just do kind of a lighter one. Sometimes you can even start by pre-positioning your fingers and just kind of straightening your arm to kind of extend your elbow. You can do it that way, or you can straighten your arm and then you can pull your fingers back. That part's probably not critical as long as you're doing one version. And again, I can, do this dynamically, or I can come in here and I can do a hold. Okay, and if I do a hold, you're going to probably want to give it a good 20, 30 second count at least. If you're getting a lot of increased symptoms as you're doing it, then obviously you'd want to back off or maybe even try it dynamically in kind of a shorter window. You could put your fingers against something if that feels kind of like it gives you a little bit more to just kind of, put your arm or your body weight into it, and that's fine. Sometimes I like doing this one on the floor, or you can do what we call a prayer stretch, okay? So basically for that, you just kind of start out with your hands here and then just kind of move your palms down towards you, okay? That's going to work both sides, but again, you're basically just stretching that connective tissue in here, trying to get some of the nerves to glide, okay? And so again, you can come in here in the prayer. And I kind of like that one sometimes a little bit better than this, but this is just kind of an easy way to dial it in. You know, hold here for pretty mindless, do that 20, 30 seconds. Or again, you can just kind of move your palms down into that prayer position. Now you may notice as well, when my arms extended on the floor, so if I'm on all fours, that also kind of accomplishes the same thing. So sometimes getting down on all fours, just kind of in a, almost a quadruped position as we call it, is also a pretty effective way to get yourself at that stretch. And then while you're there, you can certainly be on all fours and then do something like maybe a cat-camel kind of motion, just to kind of give yourself a little thoracic mobility while you're getting that stretch. And then you can do that for 20 or 30 seconds. So again, I like to do things that give you a little more bang for your buck. The nice thing is you really don't even have to get up out of your seat, though, to do this one and this one. So if you're in an office, you may not be able to get down on all fours, or maybe you can, but you feel like you look, kind of awkward. So I would say, maybe try one of the other two. But if you're at home and you can get down on the mat, it's also probably a good idea to just kind of get out of that chair for, your back as well. So you can kind of kill two birds with one stone there. But that's pretty much the wrist extension stretch in a nutshell. Now this is an exercise you're going to see a lot too, is they're going to show you how to do the opposite, which is the flexion stretch. And so you see people kind of do this type of thing. Now in theory, when you do the flexion stretch, you're actually kind of closing down that carpal tunnel, and that's kind of the problem you're already up against. So I personally am not as big of a fan of doing that kind of stretch, and again, you could do more what they call it's like a Phelan's test is what the technical name for this test. And sometimes that's actually a way to test if somebody has carpal tunnel. And so you basically can, push down like this. But again, if you're going to be closing down that carpal tunnel, I don't necessarily think that's going to be your best move all the time. So I actually don't really do that one, but you can do some active wrist flexion with extension. And so sometimes that one can be a little bit better. And so again, sometimes you can just rest your fist on an armrest. So again, if I'm working in an office, you can just do this for a minute or two. Almost imagine like if you have an imaginary bar in your hand. I did show a flex bar video, and so I don't want to load you guys up with equipment you're not necessarily going to need, but a flex bar could be something you could try to give a little bit of resistance to this movement. So if you're interested in how to do that, I'll post a link to my flex bar video at the end, and you can certainly try with a flex bar, but I've found even just body weight can be a pretty good way to go here. And again, you could also do this with palms open if you wanted to, or, fists, okay? And so again, if I were going to give you a count on this, again, I would say probably just do it for a minute or so. If you really want to give it a number, though, try and do it for like 20 or 30, okay, somewhere in that neck of the woods. And that's just your flexion, extension, range of motion, essentially, active range of motion as they call it, okay? And then after that one, if you wanted to, just to kind of cover your bases, you could do a little bit of ulnar and radial deviation while you're there, okay? And that pretty much, so again, just to show you the first one, that was here. Second one is palms facing each other. And again, I could do this with palms up as well, okay, or fists, and just kind of going back and forth, okay? And again, that might even look like, if you're doing some circling, that's something you could maybe even try as well, okay? So nothing too fancy here. This is pretty basic stuff. All we're really, again, trying to do is just get that nerve gliding through the carpal tunnel. And so there's a few different ways we could do it, okay? That first stretch is going to hopefully try to open up that space, and then some movement is going to hopefully help to kind of get it gliding. And so there's no reason why you couldn't, in theory, do a few of these, come in here, do a few of these, maybe even just do a little bit of, circling in each direction, okay? Just to kind of break it up a little bit rather than having to just kind of purely stick with one thing. I don't necessarily think you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck by just sticking with one. But again, if you have found that a certain movement seems to help, like I don't know if you maybe just tried this inadvertently on your own and that helps, well then obviously you can just stay with that movement. You don't necessarily have to layer onto the cake with all the circling. Okay, and if you've already been looking into this problem, you might have seen a median nerve glide. That's a pretty common nerve glide for specifically your median nerve. And so essentially, what you're going to tend to do is you extend your if you were to start with a fist, you extend your hand and then you supinate, okay? So basically, again, what that looks like is my hand starts out as a fist. I kind of extend my wrist and my fingers. Then I turn my palm up. And then sometimes I'll show grabbing that finger and giving it a little bit more to it, okay? And again, I can do that dynamically, where I kind of come in here, come back, come here, come back, okay? And again, I'm trying to really just get a bit of extension. And again, this can be somewhat of a provocative movement, meaning sometimes it can make your symptoms a little bit worse. But hopefully you'll notice that pain kind of goes away and starts to diminish. And if you shake it out for a second, you should feel like, okay, that's kind of easing up. If you're noticing like, oh, wow, it's actually kind of a little more intense now, that may not be the stretch for you. So sometimes nerve flossing can be a good thing, but sometimes you're also winding up that nerve, and if that nerve is really irritable already, sometimes it fans the flames. So you may want to start with some of the earlier variations, but again, the median nerve glide is there for you if that one helps you. And, again, if you were going to do a static hold on that, so let's just say you were going to come in here, so you could, again, if I were going to give that a hold, I might do it again for like a 20, 30-second count somewhere in that neck of the woods, okay? All right, so now I want to show you guys one of my favorite exercises. This one actually does take some equipment. I don't know if you exactly call this an equipment. It's basically a fancy rubber band. You can just use a standard rubber band, and I'm assuming if you're in an office, you probably can find one. These ones are by Iron Mind, though, and I actually like them because they come in different tensions. So you can basically get these pretty strong. And so what you tend to do is open your hand against the resistance of this band. And so what I like about this is that we tend to do a lot of clasping and grasping and gripping all the time, a lot of pushing with our fingers. We don't tend to get a lot of opportunity to kind of extend our fingers against resistance. And so this is a great way to kind of open that carpal tunnel. And so you can even extend your wrist as you open and spread your fingers. And so that's kind of a cool way to try to open that carpal tunnel as you get a little bit of resistance to those extensor muscles of the fingers. And so I like doing this a lot. And again, this is just another one you can just kind of mindlessly do when you're sitting down at your desk. You can do this when you're sitting down watching television. This is one of those things you could do a little bit throughout the day. And I think this is actually a pretty good bang for your buck exercise. And so again, you can do fingers by themselves, or you can kind of combine with that little bit of that wrist extension as you open. So you kind of extend and you kind of open. And I think that's a really great movement. So again, I'll put the link to these at the bottom. These are the Iron Mind ones. No reason why you couldn't just use a rubber band. And if you're having a rubber band, that's pretty easy. Obviously, you can loop it up or just use a couple of rubber bands. You don't necessarily have to buy these. I just think they're kind of cool because, again, I'm a fitness gadget guy, and I like bands, and I just think this is kind of a simple, nice little tool you can use at your desk. Okay, last one I'm going to show you guys. This is kind of a bonus exercise. Basically, all you're going to do on this one is just kind of put your fingers together and open them, okay? So it's going to look kind of like that other one. The only difference is now you can get a little bit more, as far as that opening than you're probably going to get here, because now you can also use the resistance provided by your arms to kind of open your hands, okay? And so you can kind of do it this way. You can, point your fingers whatever direction you like. And so you're basically just trying to get, your hands to open. And so I just kind of like to go more in the finger department. You don't always have to push your palms together. So this ends up looking a little bit like that prayer one I was showing you a moment ago, but it's just for your fingers. And so this one I've found to be quite helpful in some people. Not everybody likes this one or does well with it, but some people do. I tend to notice, sometimes, especially women more than men, tend to have a little more hypermobility. And so they're a little more lax, whereas guys sometimes have a little bit stiffer hands. And so I think for some, males especially, sometimes having a little bit more of that elasticity, a little more of that movement into the finger extension can help. Whereas a lot of females can get there, sometimes they actually need a little bit more stability. They almost need, they're almost too loose in their fingers, whereas maybe they would do better with that rubber band opening, whereas a male might do better with this exercise. You can kind of, again, experiment. It's going to take a little trial and error sometimes, but those exercises are there for you, and I'd encourage you to give it a try. Okay, so the last honorable mention I'll make for the video today is essentially going to be splinting. So sometimes people do need to put themselves in a little bit of an extension splint. And again, same thing, you're just going to pre-position that hand into a little more extension, and that way you can continue your keyboarding. I'll try and maybe put a link to one at the bottom in the description. If anybody knows, a good one too, you can also leave a comment below. But I like the ones that necessarily, just kind of cross against the thumb here. It puts against the forearm and just puts you into a little bit of extension here. If you were to, go on Amazon or Google and just type in wrist extension splint, I'm sure there's a ton of options. Just something that basically holds you there. I'm not necessarily too picky about which one to use. Some people, again, are really what I call brace guys, and some people aren't. I'm a little bit less of a brace guy. I really only like to use a brace when I'm really convinced that somebody needs it. I'm not necessarily going to say, let's throw that brace on right away. That being said, sometimes people are going to need it. And so if I'm thinking that somebody might need a brace, again, that's usually going to be that person that has to continue working. They have a desk job, they've got a keyboard, and there's just really no way around it. They can't take a break. Maybe they could take, leave for a little while, but ultimately they're going to have to do some keyboarding. That's the person I'm going to say, well, we just got to get you through it. Let's go ahead and put a brace on. If I'm going to try a brace in somebody else, though, that maybe can give themselves a little more of a break, usually I'll start by maybe having them try it at night. So maybe they can sleep with it, if that's not too disruptive to the sleep. Maybe go there as a first line, see if we can get that nerve to calm down a little bit, and then hopefully wean them off of it. And then, last ditch resort, obviously put the brace on, put it on pretty much all the time. But again, I try not to go there because, again, when you start bracing things, you sort of take away the body's ability to do that function. Kind of like putting your arm in a cast, it's going to get weaker because you're not using that arm the way you ordinarily would. Now, that being said, though, sometimes that nerve is just really irritated. You got to get it to calm down. and so you got to give it a break, and that's why you have to put it in a little bit of extension, which you're basically, again, just trying to open up that carpal tunnel a little bit to give that nerve some breathing room throughout the day. I don't get really specific about the sets and reps on these. Again, I say with the stretches, 20, 30 seconds is fine. You can try and do it a few times throughout the day. As far as the rep counts on these, just go to fatigue, or maybe just give it a minute or so. If you're doing the resistance against that rubber band, you don't have to go for 10 minutes, because again, if you're going too long, too much of a good thing isn't always wonderful, and so you can get to that point of diminishing return. But if you do it for a minute or two, a couple of times throughout the day, I think that's totally fine. And again, you're going to play it based on how your symptoms are. So if you're getting more symptomatic as you're doing it, well, what I would always do, and my first line always is not to start with 10 exercises. Pick a few and start there and kind of gradually see how things develop. Because again, if you start with 10 different exercises and you're worse, well, was it one of those exercises you did, or was it the fact you just did 10 different things that you've never done before? And sometimes it could be one, or it could be a combination of both. But it's a little tricky when you have to go back to the drawing board and kind of tease that out. So I'll usually recommend starting with the first kind of basic ones. And again, that would assume your symptoms are milder. You kind of shake it out. You kind of do some wrist extension, flexion. You can do your ulnar radial deviation or some circling. Just some kind of basic stuff. If you want to throw a little bit of that prayer pose in there, the extension stretch, that's just really easy first line stuff. And hopefully that stuff shouldn't be too provocative. So you can maybe start there, and then you can kind of ratchet up as you go. Again, you could add in, maybe that median nerve stretch where, you're kind of doing that. You could even add in again, and I think actually that is something you could do in the very beginning, is adding in that rubber band exercise, because that one's not too provocative. It's a pretty good one to strengthen, again, some of those extensor muscles. So again, most of the tendons are in here, the muscle bellies are down in the forearm, but it's just a great way to kind of get things opening up and gliding. So I like that exercise. That's my 2 cents for today on carpal tunnel. Again, nerves can be pesky. It's hard to predict nerve tissue recovery compared to, say, muscle or bone. So sometimes, again, you just have to kind of play it based on your symptoms. If you're getting better, though, that's generally a good sign that nerve is starting to recover. Hopefully, again, you're getting less of that, tingling or the buzzing, or, less of that. One of the things I have noticed, though, when a nerve has been irritated for a fairly prolonged period of time, if there's motor and sensory loss, meaning it's numb, and also you're starting to develop a little bit of weakness, a lot of times the motor will come back a little bit quicker than the sensory. So sometimes you might notice, oh, the hand is getting stronger again. And, if you were in a physical therapy office, you can actually measure that. But, just objectively, if you just notice that, hey, I'm, just grasping for things and I'm basically getting better there, well, obviously that's great feedback as well. But if you're also noticing that, well, this numbness, though, is still hanging around, sometimes that can be kind of typical. So I wouldn't necessarily get too bummed out if you're getting stronger, but you're not necessarily getting a return in that sensation, because sometimes that can just hang around a little longer. And sometimes, again, the stock phrase from a lot of, hand surgeons and different orthopedists I've talked to is, when it comes to nerve damage, sometimes they'll say give it months, because months, even years sometimes, it can just take a while for nerve regeneration to happen. It's a pretty slow growth process that you're asking to happen. So, and again, my 2 cents is always try and stop it before it starts, hopefully before it got to that period. But again, you may need to use the splinting if you're somebody that just has to keyboard and you really can't get away from that. But you may want to rethink the way that you keyboard, or, trying to break it up to the degree as you can, because activity modification is going to be an important part of this as well. Because sometimes even in the best conditions, best exercises, if you are repetitively doing something that's really offending that nerve, then sometimes it's just going to be a hard thing to really keep at arm's length. And so again, you may need to talk that over with somebody who can kind of help you figure out some good strategies there. But once again, I appreciate you guys watching today. Hopefully that wasn't too long-winded for you. Again, these exercises I have found to be pretty helpful, so I certainly hope that'll be the case for you. Definitely comment below. Let me know what you guys think, and like if you like this stuff. And as always, I hope you guys have some fun.